Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on leveraging EQ for better productivity. Today's webinar is hosted by Talent Smart EQ, and don't worry if you did miss our August webinar or any of our past webinars that we've held. No worries, you don't have to have listened to those in order to be able to get some really good relevant information out of today's webinar. At the end of the webinar today, we'll be sure to share the link for where you can find our webinar library. We hold tons of webinars every month on all sorts of topics in relation to emotional intelligence. So we'll be sure to share that information with you afterward. For those of you who aren't familiar with us at Talent Smart EQ, we are the world's premier provider of emotional intelligence development, assessments, training, certification, and coaching. We've been in business for almost 20 years now, and everything that we do is all centered around emotional intelligence in the workplace. My name is Kate Barsby. I am the Director of Marketing at Talent Smart EQ, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Before I introduce my partner for the webinar, I would love to take care of a few quick housekeeping items. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the GoToWebinar system, what you should see is right on the right-hand side of your screen. That's where your GoToWebinar control panel should be, and that is where you can adjust your audio and your video settings. That also is where you have the opportunity to ask questions throughout today's webinar. So you do see a small notation that says questions with a little arrow next to it. If you click that little arrow, that will bring down a text field that you can type your question into. We will be devoting a portion at the end of today's webinar purely to Q&A. So at any time throughout today's webinar that you do have a question, feel free just to go ahead and type it right into that question box, and we'll circle back at the end and answer as many of those as we can for our attendees. Today's webinar will be recorded, so for anybody hopping on late or needs to hop off early, no worries at all. Everybody that registered will receive a recording of the webinar about 1 hour after it completes, and you'll get that to the email that you registered with, so be sure to keep an eye out for that. Our content will run for approximately 30 to 35 minutes or so, and then we'll be devoting those last 10 minutes or so, as I shared, about purely to a question and answer session. Additionally, at the very end of the webinar, a survey will populate on screen. It's a quick 5 questions. We really do appreciate that feedback at Talent Smart EQ. It allows us to continue making sure that we're creating content that is very helpful, relevant, and in the moment, and that all of our attendees find everything that we share to be extremely helpful in helping their success at work. So please do share that feedback with us. We appreciate it. So without further ado, I would love to jump in and get started. As I shared, my name is Kate Barsby. I'm the Director of Marketing for Talent Smart EQ, and I will be serving as our technical producer or in our driver's seat, or our chauffeur, if you will. I'm tuning in from beautiful San Diego. Joining us from Maryland will be Sue DeLazaro, and Sue is our Executive Vice President of Programs at Talent Smart EQ. She'll be our tour guide today and subject matter expert. So without further ado, I'd love to now take the opportunity to introduce Sue to you all, and you can give a quick introduction to yourself. Sue, hello, and can you hear me okay?
I sure can. Kate, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you great, thanks.
Okay, super. Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. Let's get started.
Great. So why don't you go ahead, Sue, and share with everyone today what we're going to be discussing in the webinar on leveraging EQ for better productivity.
Sure. This topic is near and dear to my heart. I think that what we're going to be talking about, I could really think back to projects that I've worked on where I have suffered from all of these issues of productivity, but thankfully we have some things that we can do to address them that I use myself. So here's what we're going to do today. We're talking about EQ and productivity, specifically how emotional intelligence connects to the idea of being productive. We're going to look at a couple of common tendencies that affect our productivity: procrastination, perfectionism, and interruption of flow. As I mentioned, I suffer from all 3 depending on the project. So I feel you if you are in the same boat. Finally, I will be sharing 6 EQ strategies that can help you boost your productivity and kind of break through whatever kind of rut you you might be in. So why don't we do a quick poll before we get started, so that we can learn a little bit more about you. Okay, so what affects your productivity the most? Think about yourself kind of over time, and fill in one of these three that you think occurs with you most when you are working on something. Do you procrastinate because it's just so hard to get started? Do you find that you're a perfectionist and that you have a hard time letting go and finishing? Or do you have a momentum issue where your flow and that rhythm of your project breaks? Take a moment and click the one that you that best represents kind of how you feel and how you work.
Great, thanks so much, Sue. So I do see the responses coming in.
Okay.
So I'm going to give it another moment or so here, and then I will close this poll out and I will share the results with everyone.
Okay.
So what we're looking at, Sue, is actually pretty close. So the majority, 36%, said they can't keep their momentum, they break their flow. 32% and 32% say, so 32% say I procrastinate, it's hard to get started. And 32% also say I'm a perfectionist. It's so hard to let go. So as I shared, the predominant number says they can't keep momentum. It seems that flow seems to be an issue. And then an equal number also shared that they're either a perfectionist or they tend to procrastinate.
Okay, great. Well, I'm here to tell you a couple of things. That the 6 strategies that we'll be sharing today, 1 or 2 or more of them might really resonate with you. And you can use these strategies with any of these 3. Whether you procrastinate, you're a perfectionist, or you have a flow issue. So the strategies will apply to all. So without further ado, let's get started. All right. So when we talk about the concept of productivity, we're so quick to talk about things that can help us or hurt us. You know, are you exercising? Are you sleeping? Are you drinking too much or too little caffeine? Are you eating the right foods? Are you tracking your goals, et cetera, et cetera? So, you know, these kind of things can help us be more productive, but in the end, it's kind of dancing around a common issue or theme that impacts our productivity, and that is our emotions. Our emotions are part of our biology. They're always present inside us, and these emotions influence our ability to focus or not, our ability to think rationally or not. So if we can learn really how to harness those emotions, you know, being aware of them and managing them in an effective, productive way, that can help us really manage our work and how productive that we are. So when we talk about managing our emotions and being aware of our emotions, that's emotional intelligence. It's your ability to recognize and understand what's going on inside you, and your skill at using that awareness really to manage yourself and also your relationships with others. Now you'll see here on the screen that emotional intelligence, also known as EQ or EI, is made up of 4 skills that you see here in green: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. Now, emotional intelligence is a skill, meaning that if you learn what to practice and how to practice, you can actually build the skill. When we talk about EQ and productivity, the strategies that we'll be sharing with you really fall under the personal competence area of self-awareness and self-management. But why don't we move on and we'll get started and talk about these 3 tendencies that lead to our unproductive behaviors. All right. These poor people here, look at them. I'm sure we've all been there at one point. The first tendency that we might fall prey to is procrastination. This is delaying or postponing something or anything that you know you need to do. And you probably know that there will be consequences if you don't do them. And that's what makes procrastination so hard. You just can't seem to get started. You know, for some, it might be being unmotivated to even do the task at hand. For others, we might be highly motivated, but just unable to get started. If you stop and think about a moment when you procrastinated, if you thought long and hard enough about it, there were probably emotions that were part of that story. Maybe you were feeling uneasy or unsure. Maybe you were feeling bored. Whatever that emotion was, there was probably an emotional component to not even starting what you know you need to do. So that is, you know, when you think about procrastination too, every minute, every day that you're procrastinating, you know you're becoming more stressed. You're probably suffering a little bit, really kind of fighting yourself. And those things really do not improve performance. So it's the initial procrastination and then the, you know, as time passes, just that growing stress that really are not helpful to our ultimate goal of finishing our work. Okay, let's move on to our second tendency. Tendency number 2 is perfectionism. It's close to procrastination. It's really about refusing to accept any standard short of absolute perfection. Up here is a picture of Aristotle. He was one of the first people on record to define and talk about perfectionism. He had a book called The Delta of Metaphysics. I have never read that book, but I will tell you that that's where perfectionism came into being. He's talking about it being like perfectionism is about being complete. And it's so good, whatever you're producing, it's so good that there's nothing better out there. And finally, something that has attained its intended purpose. Now, when you think about your perfectionism, well, procrastination is happening at the beginning. Perfectionism can happen at any point in your work. It could happen at any point, you know, really the middle, the end, especially. Thinking about closing a big project and not being able to let go, that's really sort of what we're focusing on here. If you think about, I don't know, you're working on a proposal or something like that and it's pretty close to finished, but you just can't seem to hit send on it. You're rereading it, you're reproofing it. You've got these fears that are building that if you send the proposal, someone's going to give you feedback and whatever is going on in your head. The longer you're holding on to this after you've proofed it, you know, 2 or 3 times, you know, there comes a moment where you have to let go. So we're going to explore the not letting go portion that leads to our perfectionism. Okay, let's move on to tendency number 3. Oh, this traffic jam. I know that we have all had our moments where we're just clocking along. We're driving on our road. Everything is great. And then all of a sudden we see the brake lights in front of us and we weren't preparing for it. We had no idea it was coming and all of a sudden we were stuck in a traffic jam. That is an interruption of flow. That's kind of what happens in our heads where everything was fine and now it's not fine and now you're just stuck. Think of a writer who, you know, has their ideas and they just can't get it out on paper. They just can't type it out. When you think about flow, you know, there's a part of it that's about focus, you know, being distracted, that just stop us from being able to do what we're supposed to do. There's a famous psychologist, and everyone put your positive thoughts toward me as I pronounce it. But Dr. Csikszentmihalyi, I think I got that right. He's the one who coined this term flow, and it's really a state of mind. He found that people who experience flow, which is not what you're seeing in this picture, are happier at work, and they're up to 5 times more productive. So achieving flow, it partially lies in the task that you're working on, but it's also about the emotions that you're feeling and the emotions that you're able to process. So you've got to sort of be in a balanced state. You can't be too anxious or too bored or too this or too that. So, you know, when we think about these 3 tendencies, there is, to all of them, there's some fear, there's different emotions that are interrupting the beginning, the middle, or the end of our work. So let's talk about what we can do about any of these 3 tendencies. All right, so thankfully, EQ is a skill. We can build it as long as we're practicing the right kind of strategies. So let's talk about what happens when you're faced with them so that you can get past them and move through these tendencies and get back to work. So the 6 strategies I'm about to share, again, you can apply to any of the tendencies that you're facing. But I would say, as I read through what these strategies are, I'm going to point out which fall in the self-awareness bucket and which fall in the self-management skill bucket. And as you read through, or as you see them, and as I read through what these strategies are, just take note of something that kind of sticks out at you as something that you're not currently doing and something that you're interested in trying. So when we talk about self-awareness, this first green skill box here, self-awareness is being able to accurately identify your own emotions and your tendencies as they're happening in the moment. Now, that means that you are probably feeling something that you may not be aware of as you experience any of those 3 tendencies. So the 3 strategies I'm going to share with you first are about getting kind of honed in and building that awareness muscle. So let's move on to our first strategy in self-awareness. The first is lean into your discomfort. People who are skilled with their emotional intelligence, they can manage their productivity by noticing their emotions and their tendencies as they're happening. When they feel something unproductive coming on, they're not pushing it away, they're not ignoring it. Instead, they're just calling it out and naming it. And by naming it and sort of acknowledging this tough moment that's just come on, you're actually leaning into this idea or concept. And by leaning into I'm starting to feel bored, I'm really getting afraid that I'm going to miss something. By acknowledging those thoughts and feelings, you can move past them and move through them a little bit faster. Ignoring it is just going to get you stuck. So remember, you can only manage the emotions that you are aware of. So working on your awareness can be super helpful in being able to manage. So remember that emotions are here inside our bodies to guide us and to inform us of important feelings that can change how we think and behave. We can't shut them off, so we can't shut them off. They're part of our biology, but what we can do is start to make sense of them. So when I say lean into your discomfort, I'm not saying put your work aside forever, turn in something bad that you're not proud of. I'm just saying put your pen down, put your computer away, and acknowledge how you're feeling, because acknowledging is really the first step to kind of getting through your issue. Let's move on to the next one. So the second strategy is stop and ask yourself why. You're feeling afraid, you're worried, whatever the feeling is that you're feeling. You know, once you've acknowledged it, it might take a couple of minutes to do this, but try to figure out what this change, what this feeling is trying to tell you. They're going to give you a clue into things that you're never going to understand unless you stop and give yourself that minute to do so. So I keep saying this, but put your pen down, put your work aside for a minute, and just ask yourself why you're in this moment. You know, maybe it is an issue of lack of sleep, or that you've been sitting at your computer for 8 hours. Maybe it could be a bunch of different things, but asking yourself why can start to give you a little bit of understanding in what got you here in the first place. And I'll tell you, the more that you can ask yourself why you do the things you do, the better aware you'll be about where these emotions are surfacing from. And over time, by the way, you'll start to understand what your tendencies are. So maybe a certain type of project you find difficult. And if you start to become aware of sort of how you're feeling in the moment, you can actually start to see some patterns and start to plan for those patterns. Okay, the third self-awareness strategy is to reflect proactively before you even begin whatever your task is or your project is. I think the first two strategies that we've talked about so far are more geared toward, oh my goodness, I'm experiencing something in the moment and I need to lean into it and I need to ask myself why when you're kind of in the middle of it. This might be something that you do, the reflecting before you begin, to think about what your past tendencies have been. You know, the proactivity of all of this, I think, can be super helpful to look inward so that you can, you know, listen for and spot and eventually manage your emotions. So planning in advance before you start work or even start your day, you're giving yourself an outlet to really express your thoughts and your feelings, what you've learned about yourself from the past. This can prevent you, I think, from having those difficult emotions and feelings well up when you're in the middle of something. You know, and if you take this idea about reflecting, you see this guy here on screen, he's writing. Journaling about your emotions can be very powerful, again, to see how you're feeling moment to moment, so that you can understand what your tendencies are. So it's something to consider that can help you plan ahead for the difficult productivity tendencies that we can fall prey to. All right, so now let's move on to the next three strategies, which fall into the self-management category. Now, self-management is being able to manage your emotions and behavior to an effective outcome. And you can only manage successfully what you are aware of. So once you're aware of your emotions, what do you do about them? This can be sort of the part two to that story. So what you're looking at here is a brain, and you know, when we experience the world around us, the stresses of life, the changing deadlines, whatever they are, this is what we call stimulus or stimuli. And that stimulus is entering at the base of our brain. That stimulus travels to the limbic system, to the middle of our brains, and that's where we're physically feeling the emotion in our bodies before it travels to the front of our brain, that rational part. And that's where we make sense and make meaning out of what's happening to us. So in this case, the strategy here is take control of your self-talk. And I am talking here about the reasoning or the rationalizing that's happening in the front of your brain. This self-talk is our script that we kind of tell ourselves when we are experiencing an emotion. It's probably a well-scripted, well-traveled path that we have been used to telling ourselves for years and years and years. So, you know, when you're feeling triggered, when you're feeling anxious or afraid of failure, what is it you're telling yourself? Are you telling yourself that you're not right for the job, or that you can't do this? Are you telling yourself maybe that you're a fake or a loser and that you're never going to get it right? Become aware of what you're telling yourself. That's really the first step. And the second step is to think about what you should be telling yourself that's positive and that's effective, that's going to help you break through that cycle of negative talk, because really negative self-talk is a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. What you tell yourself is what you will end up showing the world. So take time and think to plan out a better response for when you're triggered next time. Maybe that positive phrase, instead of saying I can never do this, is, you know what, take it one step at a time, or I can do this, I've done it before and I'm going to do it again. Think about what your self-talk is that might not be getting you the results you want, and then practice. That's what these strategies are all about. Okay, let's move on to the next strategy. This is stay synchronized. So keeping your mind and your body in sync with whatever your situation is in front of you is super important. So when you feel like emotions are starting to take hold of you, where to the point where they're paralyzing you, or you know, you're stuck from, you're unable to let go and hit send on whatever you're working on, be aware that your emotions are starting to take over, and refocus on the task at hand that you need to do. There's certainly a self-talk aspect to that, but be aware that you can manage both your mind and your body to be synchronized to get done what you need to get done. So when you start to get unfocused, when you start to feel like your emotions are beginning to take over, be aware of that. Take a moment, take some breaths, take a walk, refocus so that you can get synchronized with your emotions and what you have in front of you. All right, next strategy, final strategy, is visualize yourself succeeding. I know this sounds probably a simple duh kind of a strategy, but you know, a lot of times when we're swirling and we're stuck in a project that we feel like we're never going to be able to start or finish, you know, think about what that end game is for you. What is your goal? What does it feel like to be finished with your goal? What does it feel like to hit send? Those moments, kind of conjuring up those positive feelings and seeing success, really is a powerful strategy that you can practice to help you get there. I know this sounds like sports psychology, and it is. You know, professional athletes, amateur athletes all have that finish line in mind. They're not worrying about tripping or not being able to catch something. They're thinking about that end game and winning the game. So to do this, you know, let your mind get quiet, turn off your music, put your computer away, and just go to a place that's quiet that you enjoy. Focus on the specifics around what's going to get you to your end game, and include your feelings and your emotions in that kind of conversation with yourself. If you can do this in advance of an unproductive behavior, like before you procrastinate or before your flow breaks, that's certainly a great thing to do, but it's also something that you can do when you recognize that you're in the thick of a moment where you're being unproductive. So you can do it in a planful way. You can do it after you've already realized that you're in the moment of trouble. So these are 3 self-awareness and 3 self-management strategies. I'm going to share on screen here a recap of these 6 strategies. You know, you can use one or more to help you kind of get through whatever is in your way at this moment. So you can lean into your discomfort. You can stop and ask yourself why. Reflect before you begin on what you know about yourself. Be aware and take control of your self-talk. Sync up with your mind and your body. And finally, visualize yourself succeeding. All right. So we have talked about 3 common tendencies and barriers that get in our way, as well as 6 strategies to help you overcome them. We have a few minutes to talk about some questions, so why don't we hit it?
Great, thank you so much, Sue. We are just at just past the 30-minute mark, so that's great. It gives us plenty of time to answer all the questions that I've seen come in throughout today's webinar. So why don't we jump right in? And I would love to pose the first question to you, Sue. Okay. What's your advice for people who reflect and realize your emotions that day are going to be a problem?
Okay, good one. So I think we all have to recognize that emotions are part of our humanity, part of our biology, and we can't shut them off. So judging them is something that you should try to not do. Just be aware that we're all experiencing hundreds of emotions every day. So if they're getting in the way of your work, you know, maybe what you can do is, if you can't take a break or you can't step away, is maybe switch what you're doing and do something maybe a little lower stakes, or something that's a change in pace that is still productive but not exactly focused on the task at hand that you're getting stuck on and feeling unproductive about. You know, that might just be the thing that helps you feel like you're making progress. You know, so kind of just doing something different for a while and then going back to whatever you have at hand. But I think at the end of the day, we shouldn't be judging ourselves for feeling what we're feeling. We should know that there are things that we can do really to help break our negative cycles and help us get what we need to get done.
Great, thanks, Sue. The next question, I like to call myself a recovering perfectionist, meaning I am still a perfectionist, but not as nearly as hard on myself as I used to be. Thoughts on helping me get over the real hump?
Yeah, first off, that sounds like you're very self-aware, that you realize that you are a perfectionist, and it sounds like you've taken steps to overcome that. So whatever you've done to get to this point, bravo for that. You know, I think that whatever you are doing that works for you, as long as you're continuing to see progress, you know, I would just recognize that it is a process. It doesn't change overnight. It probably won't even change in, you know, over the course of a couple of months. It's a longer term change. So if you find yourself in recovery, but you have strategies in place, I would say stick with those and just recognize that it takes time. If you feel like you need different ideas to let go sooner, you know, maybe you try 1 or 2 of the strategies that we talked about today, you know, that jump out at you the most. And I think that really counts for all of us on this webinar. If you're finding an idea that's new or different something that you haven't yet tried, and it's jumping out at you for any reason, I would say start there and just explore the idea and see if it helps you get over the hump faster. And keep up the good work, by the way. Great. I'm very happy that you're recovering.
Great, thanks so much, Sue. A few have actually asked for me to put back on screen the 6 strategies that we recommended. These first 3, as Sue had shared, are focused on self-awareness, so leaning into your discomfort, stop and asking yourself why you do the things you do, and reflecting before you begin. And then those second 3 strategies are focused on the self-management piece that Sue spoke about. So that's taking control of your self-talk, staying synchronized, and visualizing yourself succeeding. So I'll just leave that on screen for a few of you. I know that requested that I put that back up for you. Some also asked, will this presentation be sent out? As I shared at the beginning, don't worry, you'll all receive a recording of the webinar as soon as we close out today. And Sue, another question, it's actually a few questions that have come in that are centered around this topic. A few have actually asked if you could share recommendations for when you actually see others exhibiting tendencies. So, how do you help people to stop from ruminating, or do you have suggestions to help other people with noticing these tendencies? Anything you can share in that regard?
Well, I think at the beginning of this webinar, I shared that I fall prey to all 3 of these at any given point, and I think that that's probably true for most of us on this webinar. So if you find that there's someone else in your work life or home life, you can let them know, hey, I kind of deal with this too. And I've tried a couple of things that have worked, and, let me tell you about them. I think having a little empathy for the other person and, being able to really feel and say that we kind of experienced something similar could be quite helpful. But, these strategies aren't hard. That's the other thing. I think there's some kind of good news. It does take practice. That's the tough news. You can't just read about it and it magically makes things better. You do have to practice. But, I think sharing what you learned today could be a huge help, because they're ideas, they're things where you can get started. So feel free to share them. That might be helpful.
Great, thanks so much, Sue. We have a time for just about one more question here, and this is a great question, and it touches on that procrastination piece. Sue, I'd love to pose this. I've noticed a sort of specific kind of procrastination that I always fall prey to. When I have a big project to work on, I always get sucked into the small everyday things at work, emails, little tasks, meetings. By the end of the day, I just don't have the energy to get after that big task anymore to get started. So how do you recommend handling that?
So, I would say that kind of it sounds like you know your rhythm. And maybe you're starting off with the small things, thinking you could get them out of the way, and then you end up getting kind of stuck there. So maybe you kind of switch your day around where, if you've got the energy in the morning and you have the focus in the morning, use that and go with it. Put your out of office on and say you're in a meeting for half a day or 2 hours or something, so that you can just kind of crank when your energy is right, your flow is there, and save that other stuff, for the middle or end of the day. I think if you can do that, if you can afford to do that, that could be worth it. But it sounds like you also know yourself. You know your tendencies, so use that information and do something with it so that you can be more productive.
Great, thank you so much, Sue. And thank you, everyone. These were actually really great questions that were submitted. It sounds like this is a topic that all of us can really relate to. Sue shared that she has been guilty of all 3 of these, at one time or another, and I certainly have as well myself. For those of you who we couldn't answer your question and have enough time today, please feel free to note that in the survey that will populate in a moment or two. Again, I know some also asked if they would receive the recording and if they could share this recording with others at their organization. Absolutely. Feel free to send this to any colleague or coworker that you might find this helpful. That's what these webinars are for. So we do have a webinar link right on our website. So you see that on screen here. That's talentsmarteq.com/webinars. We also have over 300 articles on our website on talentsmarteq.com/articles. So feel free to check those out or to share those with any of your colleagues as well. And our next upcoming webinar that will take place at the end of October, Sue will be leading that webinar for us as well as our subject matter expert. And that is on conquering the fear of the unknown. So just in time for Halloween, so I love that theme. So thank you so much, everybody. I think that this was a great topic to cover. I love the questions that came in. And Sue, thank you so much for leading us through this discussion. I know that everyone found it really helpful. Are there any closing thoughts you'd love to share with our attendees today?
No, I would just say thank you so much for joining, and thank you, Kate, and pick a strategy that jumps out at you and start practicing. And we'll see you next month.
Great, thank you so much, Sue. Everyone, as I shared, keep an eye out for that recording. You'll get it in about 1 hour to the email address that you registered with. And in about a moment or two, a survey will populate on screen, and it's about 5 or 6 questions. We appreciate that feedback at Talent Smart EQ. Thanks for joining us today. We hope you have a great remainder of your morning, afternoon, or evening. Everyone, take care. Bye-bye.